Hey there, and welcome to Earthup. Think of this place as a slow corner of the internet, the kind you visit when the day has finally loosened its grip on you. Nothing here is in a hurry. It's more like a late night conversation with a friend who doesn't need you to be on, doesn't need quick replies, and is happy to just sit with an idea for a while. Tonight, we're going to wander into a question that's been quietly sitting in the background of human imagination for a very long time. What if the world you and I know isn't the first world of its kind? What if the story of civilization didn't start with us at all, but with something far older, an age so thoroughly erased that what's left of it is more like a shadow than a memory, an outline we only feel when we bump into questions we can't quite answer? There's something strangely comforting about that thought. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just calming. It asks you to loosen your sense of where we fit on the timeline. To imagine humans not as the beginning of anything, but as one moment in a chain of moments, most of which we'll never see. This isn't the kind of idea that demands a hot take. It's more like the feeling you get when the lights are low, the room is quiet, and your brain finally has enough space to wander without needing to solve anything. Before we float too far out into deep time, I'd actually love to ground things for a second. Where are you listening from right now? You don't have to answer out loud, obviously, but just notice it for yourself. Maybe you're curled up in bed, phone propped up on a pillow. Maybe you're half asleep on the couch with the video playing in the background. Maybe you're in a small kitchen with one dim light on, or in a room that's finally quiet after a long day. What time is it for you? Late enough that your eyes feel heavy? Early enough that the rest of the evening is still stretching out in front of you? Wherever you are in your own little slice of time, I'm really glad you're here, drifting through this moment with me. And if you enjoy this kind of soft, slow exploration, where we talk about big questions without rushing toward big answers, it genuinely helps this small corner of the internet when you like the video or subscribe. It's one of the easiest ways to teach the algorithm that calm curiosity deserves some space online, too. But that's not why you're here. You're here for the question, for the quiet pull of a what if that doesn't need to be solved tonight. So let's ease into it. Not with bold claims or certainty, but with a slow walk through an idea. What if we, with our satellites and skyscrapers and smartphones, aren't the first civilization to reach this level of complexity on Earth? Most of us were taught to picture human history as a straight line. Caves, villages, cities, electricity, medicine, the internet, whatever comes next. In that version of the story, with a main event, everything before us is prehistory. Everything after us is the future. It's neat. It's tidy. It makes sense emotionally, even if it's not very realistic geologically, because Earth doesn't move in straight lines. Our planet works in cycles. It has hit reset on life again and again. Oceans have risen and swallowed entire landscapes, then fallen back and exposed new ones. Continents have pulled apart, drifted, and crashed into each other. Forests have appeared, thrived, and vanished. Whole ecosystems have come and gone so many times that the surface of the planet is less like an archive and more like a palimpsest, a page that's been written on, erased, and written over millions of times. When you see Earth that way, the question we're asking tonight stops sounding strange and starts sounding quietly reasonable. If this planet has been resetting itself over and over for hundreds of millions of years, is it really so impossible that some intelligent civilization might have risen long before humans ever existed? Something that grew and learned and built and peaked and then disappeared so completely that what's left of it is buried so deep or scattered so thoroughly that we no longer recognize any of it for what it was. That doesn't mean it did happen. It just means the idea isn't as far-fetched as it sounds at first glance. The Earth is very, very old. Our species is very, very new. But let's not rush ahead. Before we dive into ancient resets or lost worlds or timelines that reach back beyond our oldest ruins, it helps to pause with something simple and human. We've always wondered what came before us. Every culture, every generation, every person who's ever stood under a night sky and felt that strange tug in their chest, every person who's walked through old ruins and felt a faint, inexplicable familiarity has brushed against this question in some form. Even before science, people told stories about cycles, worlds created, destroyed, and remade, myths of golden ages and great floods, tales of earlier peoples who lived in different conditions under different skies. We usually file those stories under metaphor or imagination, a poetic way for ancient people to process disasters, or to express the feeling that the earth is older and stranger than any one culture can fully grasp. But even when stories aren't literally true, they tend to grow out of real emotions. And beneath those old tales of rise and fall, there's a feeling we still recognize. The sense that humanity might not always have been at the center of the timeline. That the world could have been full and busy long before we showed up. This isn't about believing that some hidden civilization built cities more advanced than ours. It's about zooming out far enough that our version of history shrinks down to what it actually is. A very thin layer of time, stacked on top of a ridiculously deep stack of earlier layers. The Earth has been holding oceans for billions of years. It's been growing forests for hundreds of millions. Dinosaurs ruled this planet for longer than humans have existed by a factor that's genuinely hard to visualize. Entire species have lived out full, complicated histories, thousands and thousands of generations, and left behind nothing more than a scattering of fossils in a rock layer. When you really sit with that, it becomes easier to imagine how fragile our own traces would be on geological timescales. If humanity vanished tomorrow, really vanished, no one left to patch roads or maintain power grids or backup servers, it wouldn't take long for the world to begin covering us up. Give it a few hundred years, and most of our buildings would be ruins. Give it a few thousand, and only scattered pieces of our largest stone structures would remain. Give a few million, and even those would be cracked, buried, recycled into new layers of rock. Whether erosion, plant roots, tectonic shifts, the slow work of oceans and ice, these things are incredibly efficient cleanup crews. They don't just topple what we build, they grind it down and file it away. So some earlier civilization did exist, tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of years before us. It's not unreasonable to think its remains could be gone now, not just ruined, but blended into the planet itself, part of the geology, part of the background. Again, that doesn't mean it did happen. It just keeps the door open. Because most of what we call history is built on an incredibly thin slice of time, the slice where humans happen to be around and writing things down. Our oldest surviving texts are a few thousand years old. Our oldest cities might reach back 10,000. Clear, organized civilizations? Maybe 12,000 years, depending on where you look and how you define them. 12,000 years sound like a lot, until you set it next to 4.5 billion. If the entire history of Earth were a giant book, human civilization wouldn't even be a full paragraph. We'd be a single line, scribbled near the bottom of one of the last pages, which leads us back, quietly, to the question, what if this isn't the first line? What if, somewhere buried deep in all the earlier pages, there were others, not necessarily human, not necessarily anything like us, just something capable of shaping its world in ways we no longer recognize. Maybe it used technologies that didn't involve metals or plastics or anything that would fossilize well. Maybe it lived in a climate so different from ours that the places it thrived no longer exist in any recognizable form. Maybe it belonged to a species that left no direct descendants, so we have no familiar skeletons to compare it to. Maybe it fell long before mammals even got their start. We're not claiming that happened. We're just letting the possibility sit in the room with us for a while. There's a kind of gentle comfort in the idea. It suggests that intelligence might not be a one-time cosmic accident. It might be something the Earth tries more than once. Something that appears when conditions line up just right. Something that grows, experiments, builds, changes the world a little, and then resets in the quiet rhythm of a planet that never stops moving. Thinking about that can make everything feel wider. The world gets a bit bigger. Time gets a bit deeper. Our everyday rush loses some of its sharp edges. Because if humanity isn't the whole story, if we're just one chapter in a very long, very old book, then we're not floating alone on a tiny timeline. We're part of a planet that has carried countless stories. Most of them gone. Many of them unimaginable. All of them written on the same Earth we're walking on right now. And as we wander further into this idea, it becomes easier to imagine that if any traces of earlier worlds do exist, They probably don't look like lost megacities or giant machines. They might be subtle. A strange rock layer here. An odd gap in the fossil record there. Little things that make us pause. Not because they prove anything, but because they remind us how young our understanding still is. We'll get to those hints. But not yet. Tonight is not a chase. It's a slow walk through time, starting from the world we know, and gently turning our attention toward the worlds that might have come before. So let's pick up from here, and take that first small step away from what we know into what we can only really wonder about. If you sit with this idea for a while, that maybe we're not the first civilization the Earth has hosted, it starts to change the way you look at the world around you. Not in a paranoid way, not like everything is a secret, but in a softer, more patient way. You start to notice how much is already mysterious, even in places that feel ordinary. A rock formation that doesn't quite match the pattern of the surrounding landscape. An artifact whose age is harder to pin down than it should be. A gap in our timeline where something seems to be missing, but we aren't sure what. These things are not proof of anything dramatic. They're not smoking guns. They're more like little bookmarks in the story of Earth that say, we don't fully understand this part yet. Our knowledge of the past is still very young. The tools we use, radiometric dating, satellite mapping, seafloor surveys, drilling into ice cores and sediment layers, are powerful, but they're only just beginning to scratch at the surface of deep time. And deep time is the key phrase here. Because when we talk about history, in the everyday sense, we're usually talking about a few thousand years. Maybe 10,000 if we stretch it. Prehistory add a little more. But it still lives in a shallow layer near the top of Earth's timeline. Geological time laughs at that kind of scale. We measure rocks and fossil layers in millions of years, sometimes hundreds of millions. On those scales, everything humans have ever done barely registers as a thin coat of dust on the surface. That's part why the idea of earlier civilizations feels both wild and quietly reasonable at the same time. On one hand, it sounds almost like science fiction. The thought that intelligent beings might have risen, built, explored, struggled, and vanished long before a species showed up. On the other hand, when you actually look at how thoroughly time can erase the record of life, it starts to seem strange that we're so confident nothing like that could have happened. If humanity vanished today and you fast forward the Earth 10 million years, what would really be left? Most of our buildings? Gone. Our bridges, our roads, our highways? Eroded, buried, or snapped apart by tectonic shifts. Our plastics and metals? Broken down, corroded, scattered into microscopic traces. The only things that might still be recognizable will be a handful of mega structures, some altered rock layers, and maybe a few weird chemical signatures in the sediment. If anyone knew where to look and what to look for. Now take that same thought experiment and stretch it not 10 million years, but 50 million, or 100. At those scales, even mountains don't hold their shape. Sea floors get recycled. Continents move. What was once a city could easily end up deep underground, or at the bottom of a future ocean, or pressed into the roots of a mountain range that doesn't exist yet. When you realize how intense that process is, it changes the question. Instead of, why haven't we found evidence of an earlier civilization? It starts to sound more like, what kind of evidence could even survive long enough for us to find it? And the honest answer might be, not much. The Earth is not a museum. It's a working studio, constantly repainting the canvas. That's why when people bring up strange anomalies, odd fossils, unusual metal spheres, rock layers that seem slightly off, we have to move carefully. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines. We're very good at seeing intention where there might be none, and very good at stitching together stories that feel satisfying even when they're not accurate. Nature can carve shapes in stone that look uncannily like tools. Water and wind can etch patterns into rock that mimic symbols. Volcanic activity, pressure, and chemical reactions can create geometric forms that resemble crafted objects. So a single weird object or a single strange layer of rock doesn't suddenly mean ancient civilization confirmed. Most of the time, the more closely scientists look at these things, the more they find natural explanations. Geological processes we didn't fully understand at first. Erosion patterns that made something look deliberate when it wasn't. Layers that were disturbed by earthquakes or ancient floods. But even as reasonable explanations step in, the questions don't completely vanish. They linger at the edges, not because we should jump to conclusions, but because they quietly highlight how incomplete our picture of the past still is. There are entire sections of the ocean floor we haven't mapped in detail. There are rock layers buried so deep we may never reach them. There are vast regions under ice, under jungle, under desert, that have barely been explored with modern tools. And then there are the places that simply no longer exist. Ancient coastlines that were drowned when sea levels rose. Land masses that were torn apart or swallowed into subduction zones. Environments where anything fragile would have decayed long before it had a chance to be preserved. When you add all of this together, you get an interesting tension. On one side, the scientific caution that says, we don't have clear evidence for any earlier advanced civilization, so we shouldn't claim one existed. On the other side, the planetary reality that says, we've erased so much of our own past that the absence of evidence doesn't tell us as much as we'd like it to. Somewhere in between those two is the space this video lives in. We're not here to treat every geological oddity as proof of something hidden. We're also not here to shut the door on the idea just because we haven't found a skyscraper fossil yet. Instead, we're holding on to a softer question. Given how vast Earth's history is, and how aggressively the planet recycles its surface, is it really so strange to imagine that intelligence might have appeared more than once? Maybe not as global as ours. Maybe not as industrial. Maybe not even as obvious. Civilization doesn't have to look like glass towers and metal bridges. It doesn't have to fling satellites into orbit. It doesn't have to leave behind plastic in the oceans or straight lines visible from space. A civilization could be smaller, more localized. It could be concentrated along an ancient coastline that's now deep underwater. It could be forest-dwelling, relying on organic materials that decay quickly. It could be ocean-based, with habits and tools that don't fossilize well at all. If something like that rose, peaked, and faded tens of millions of years ago, we might not be looking for the right kind of traces. We'd expect stone, metal, clearly carved surfaces. But what if the traces that survive best aren't objects at all? What if the only thing deep time can really preserve from a civilization is its side effects? Subtle chemical shifts in rock layers, unusual concentrations of particular elements, thin bands of sediment that show sudden changes in climate or land use or atmospheric composition. And here's where it gets tricky. Nature can do all of those things by herself. Volcanoes can change the atmosphere. Asteroid impacts can spread rare elements around the globe. Massive wildfires, algae blooms, and sudden climate swings can leave chemical fingerprints that look strange millions of years later. So even if some of the odd signatures we see in ancient rocks were the result of an earlier civilization, it would be incredibly hard to prove. The line between natural event and artificial event gets blurrier the farther back you go. That's why, in this conversation, we keep coming back to possibility instead of proof. The point isn't to insist that there was an ancient civilization before us. The point is to notice that the idea fits comfortably inside what we already know about time, erosion, and the limits of our own knowledge. And when you let that possibility sit in your mind for a while, something interesting happens. Human history starts to feel smaller in a good way, less like the main story of the planet, and more like the current chapter. We stop seeing ourselves as a starting point of civilization and start seeing ourselves as one version of something Earth might try again and again. Intelligence that wakes up, looks around, asks questions, builds things, and tries to understand its place in a world that was ancient long before it arrived. In a moment, we're going to walk a little deeper into that thought. We'll look at how often entire eras of life have disappeared, and how easy it is for a fully developed story to be compressed down into a thin, silent line in the rock. Not to scare ourselves, just to understand the scale of the stage we're standing on. Let's drift a little deeper into time. If you could peel the Earth open like a layered cake and walk sideways through its history, you'd see something surprising. It's not a smooth, gradual gradient from simple to complex, quiet to busy. It's more like a sequence of worlds stacked on top of each other, each one with its own rules, its own creatures, its own version of normal. And over, those worlds end. Not always dramatically. Not always with fire and asteroids and chaos. Sometimes they just change, slowly, quietly. So quietly that if you were living through it, you might not notice you were in the middle of a transition at all. Most of us grow up with the basic idea that there were dinosaurs, and then an asteroid, and then eventually humans. But that's like summarizing an entire library with there were some books, and then some other books. Before the dinosaurs, there were already countless eras of life. Forests that grew in climates we can barely imagine. Seas filled with creatures we don't have names for. Landscapes that look nothing like the continents we recognize on a map. Each of these eras wasn't a preface or a warm-up for the species living in those times. They were the main story. They evolved, adapted, competed, and thrived. They had predator-prey dynamics, migrations, breeding seasons, complex ecosystems. Some may have had social structures we'll never understand. And then, at some point, their time was over. Maybe slowly, maybe quickly. But once they were gone, all those intricate relationships, all those normal daily lives shrank down into a layer of rock a few centimeters thick. If you've ever seen a cliff or a canyon wall with visible stripes running through it, those stripes are like pages of a book. Each band of color is a snapshot of an ancient world, pressed flat and stored away. But none of those layers come with labels. No captions. No once upon a time here lived. Geologists can read patterns in them. They can infer climate, estimate sea levels, spot signs of mass extinctions, trace the rise and fall of ocean chemistry. But what they're working with are fragments, small, scattered details from lives that have been mostly erased. That's the part that matters for the question we're exploring. Because of entire ecosystems, spanning tens of millions of years, can be reduced to a thin stripe of stone. What happens to something as fragile and brief as a civilization? Think about how rarely fossilization even happens. For a bone to become a fossil, a lot of things have to go right. The animal has to die in just the right place. Somewhere sediment will quickly bury it before scavengers or bacteria break apart. The chemistry of the surrounding environment has to be just right for minerals to slowly replace the organic material. The layers above have to remain relatively undisturbed for millions of years. Then those layers have to be pushed back up to the surface by geological forces. And then someone has to be in the right place at the right time to notice it, dig it up, and recognize what it is. Most living things never get anywhere near that process. They decay, they get eaten, they fall apart, they vanish. So when we look at the fossil record and see gaps, those gaps don't necessarily mean nothing was there. They often mean something was there, but conditions weren't kind to its remains. Now, layer civilization on top of that reality. Most of what we build is even less likely to fossilize than bone. Wood rots, clay crumbles, metals corrode, plastics break down under sunlight and heat, concrete cracks and turns back into gravel. Even our most monumental structures only exist because we're constantly repairing them. Stop maintaining a building, and the decay clock starts immediately. If you give nature a couple of centuries, it will reclaim a city. Give a few thousand years, and whatever's left will be patchy at best. Give it 1,000,000, and you're probably looking at either rubble buried under layers of soil or rock that has no obvious connection to what once stood there. Now stretch that thinking out across tens of millions of years, and you start to see why the idea of no evidence, therefore no civilization, becomes a bit shaky. It's not that we should assume there was someone before us. It's that we can't be quite as confident that we definitely know if there had been. And this is where another layer of quiet curiosity comes in. Because when you zoom even farther out, beyond fossils, beyond individual species, beyond any one age, you see a repeating pattern in Earth's history. Growth, complexity, disruption, reset. Life fills available niche spaces, invents new ways of surviving, forms intricate webs of interaction. Then something happens. Sometimes it's dramatic, an asteroid impact, a massive volcanic event, a runaway climate shift. Sometimes it's slower, a gradual change in temperature or sea level or atmospheric chemistry. Whatever the cause, the result is similar. A lot of what existed before disappears. New opportunities open up. Life, in its stubborn creativity, begins again from what's left. Each reset wipes away details, but leaves behind a slightly altered canvas. The idea we're exploring in this series is just an extension of that pattern. If Earth has been running this experiment, what happens when you let life adapt and adapt and adapt? For billions of years, why would intelligence be a one-time fluke? Why wouldn't the planet accidentally stumble into it more than once? Maybe most of those attempts never get very far. Maybe some species get clever but never organize into civilizations. Maybe others build small, local societies that never become planetary. Scale. But here's the quiet, intriguing part. Even if one of those earlier attempts did manage to reach a point somewhat like ours, there's no guarantee we'd find anything solid from it now. We might only see the same things we see already. A layer that hints at a sudden change in climate, an odd distribution of certain elements in rock, a puzzling shift in fossils where species vanish more abruptly than we'd expect. And we'd likely do exactly what we do now, look to natural explanations first. Because nature does do these things on its own. Volcanoes can inject gases into the atmosphere. Asteroids can blanket the Earth in dust. Shifts in the planet's orbit can change climate gradually or suddenly. So even if there were an artificial signal hidden in all that noise, it would have to be incredibly obvious to stand out. Something so strange and out of place that it couldn't be explained any other way. So far, we haven't seen anything like that. But that doesn't close the door. It just means that if any earlier civilization existed, it either didn't leave behind strong global signatures, or its traces have been smoothed out by time until they're indistinguishable from the planet's own processes. And that loops us back to something important. This whole conversation works best when we hold it gently, not as a debate to win, not as a mystery to force, solve, but as a different lens to look at ourselves through. Because the more you understand about how easily worlds disappear into thin rock layers, the more you realize how thin our own layer is. Our cities feel enormous. Our technologies feel permanent. Our data feels like it will last forever because it lives in cloud, even though that cloud is just hardware that needs power and people and repairs. On human timescales, it all seems lasting. On geological timescales, it's a brief, bright flare. And there's something strangely grounding about that realization. It doesn't make what we do meaningless. If anything, it makes it more precious. We are a civilization that became aware of deep time. We're able to look backward billions of years and forward billions more. We can ask questions about our own place in the chain of worlds that came and went. If intelligence has appeared before, it might not have had that view. It might have lived and faded without ever realizing how vast the story of Earth really is. We do know we're standing here at this tiny moment near the end of a very long page, looking both ways. And from here, the question quietly reshapes. Not just did someone come before us, but also, if they did, what patterns might we be repeating without knowing it? In the next stretch, we'll wander into that. Into how civilizations rise, drift toward complexity, and then slowly fall back into the landscape, and how that familiar pattern might echo far deeper into time than our own written history can reach. Let's slow down and talk about something we do understand fairly well. How civilizations rise and fall when we can actually see the evidence. Because once you see the pattern clearly in the part of history we know, it becomes easier to imagine that similar arcs might have played out in ages we don't. When we think about a civilization appearing, it's easy to picture a dramatic moment. The first city, the first great monument, the first big leap forward. But in reality, civilizations don't show up that way. They don't just blink into existence. They creep in. If you zoom in close, the beginning looks almost boring. A small village near a river. A group of people figuring out where to plant food. A few homes clustered together for safety, for trade, for company. Then, over generations, subtle shifts begin to stack up. Someone figures out better ways to store grain. Someone else specializes in a craft instead of farming. Shelters get a little sturdier. Paths between homes turn into roads. A communal space appears. Somewhere to gather, to trade, to share stories, to make decisions. If you pause at any one of those steps and ask, is this a civilization yet? The answer might still feel like no, it's just a bigger village, just a busier settlement. But change doesn't care whether we give it a label. It keeps accumulating. Storage pits become granaries. Granaries become warehouses. Temporary meeting spots become permanent buildings. Roles within the community multiply. Leaders, record keepers, builders, traders, farmers, craftspeople. And then at some point, without anyone calling it out, you look around and realize this isn't just a village anymore. You have a system. You have layers of organization. You have shared beliefs and rules and structures that shape how people move through their days. That's what we call civilization. Not a single invention, but a web of small changes that quietly cross a threshold. The same thing happens in reverse when civilizations decline. From far away in time, it can look like a sharp collapse. This empire fell in this year. That city was abandoned. Those people vanished from the record. But if you were standing inside that world, it probably didn't feel like a sudden drop. It felt like a series of problems. The harvests weren't as good as they used to be. Trade routes shifted. Rivers flooded differently. Storms came at the wrong time. There were more conflicts over land, over food, over power. Infrastructure started to fray at the edges. Roads didn't get maintained as often. Buildings needed repair and didn't always get it. People moved away from certain areas, chasing better land or calmer weather. One generation might say, things have been hard lately. The next might say, we don't really use that old building anymore. The one after that might not even know what the building used to be for. From their perspective, life is just life. They're dealing with what's in front of them, not thinking in terms of rise and fall. And slowly, over decades or centuries, the complexity that made the civilization what it was starts to thin out. The population shrinks. Institutions weaken. Big projects stop. Knowledge splinters or gets lost as people scatter. Eventually, the last person walks away from a city that once felt permanent. Plants move in. Animals move in. Weather does the rest. To us, looking back, that whole process becomes a single sentence. The civilization declined and disappeared. But the reality was a long, gentle unwinding. And this pattern shows up over and over. Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Maya, ancient Chinese dynasties, countless smaller cultures whose names we barely know. They rise not with fireworks, but with gradual change. They fade not with single crash, but with a slow, quiet loosening. Now, imagine stretching that entire arc, not over a few hundred or a few thousand years, but over millions. Imagine a species that gradually becomes more intelligent, not overnight, not with one genius ancestor, but through evolutionary pressure, cooperation, problem solving, environmental challenges. They learn to coordinate. They develop tools, though maybe not the stone or metal ones we expect. They form complex social structures, traditions, and shared knowledge. They learn to harvest energy in ways that give them free time to think, to experiment, to shape their environment. Over a long, long time, their version of civilization emerges. Maybe they never cover the entire planet. Maybe they stay concentrated in certain regions, along ancient coasts or in dense, resource-rich environments. From their perspective, they might feel like the center of the story. They might feel as permanent as we do, but their world is still Earth. And Earth, as we've seen, doesn't sit still. Climate shifts. Land rises and sinks. Rain patterns move. Resources they depend on become harder to access. Maybe they adapt a little, but not enough. Maybe a few key niche spaces they rely on disappear. Over time, their civilization might start to follow the same pattern we've seen in our own history, just stretched across a much larger canvas. Growth, stability, stress, fragmentation, fade. No single dramatic end of the world. Just an accumulation of small disruptions until the structures that held everything together weaken beyond repair. The species itself might linger for a while after their peak. Smaller groups could survive in isolated pockets, living simpler lives, losing access to the tools and knowledge that once defined their height. And then, eventually, they too vanish. What's left behind? Well, that depends on where and how they lived. If they built near coasts, which many species, including us, tend to do, rising seas could have erased most of their structures. If they favored warm, wet climates, decay would have eaten through organic materials quickly. if they lived in regions prone to tectonic upheaval. Their cities might have been pushed deep into the earth, crushed and reheated until nothing recognizable remained. Whatever traces did survive would then have to move through the same harsh filter everything else does. Millions of years of erosion, burial, pressure, and transformation. By the time anyone came along with drills and microscopes and satellite maps, the story of that civilization might be condensed into a handful of anomalies so subtle that no one even thinks to interpret them as signs of intelligence. A slightly odd chemical layer here. A confusing gap in the fossil record there. A patch of ancient sediment that hints at widespread environmental change. We do what we always do. Start with the most likely explanation. Volcanoes, impacts, natural climate cycles. And most of the time, we'd probably be right. But the possibility remains, quietly in the background, that a civilization could rise, flourish, and disappear in deep time, following the same basic pattern we see in human history, and leave behind almost nothing we'd recognize. That doesn't mean we should assume it happened. It just means that when we look at the rise and fall of civilizations we can see, and then lay that pattern over the vast, mostly silent expanse of Earth's earlier ages, the idea of someone before us stops feeling like pure fantasy and starts feeling like one more option on a very long list of possibilities. And here's where it circles back to us. Because when we picture an ancient civilization disappearing into the landscape, it becomes a little easier to imagine our own world from the outside. If someone millions of years in the future were to study the layers we're creating right now, they wouldn't see our feelings or our fears or our dreams. They wouldn't know our languages or stories. Most of our buildings would be gone. Most of our tools would be dust. They'd see a few abrupt changes. A spike in certain elements. Strange compounds in the sediment. Fossil evidence of one species suddenly spreading everywhere and then maybe disappearing. From that distance, we look like any other rise and fall. One more story layered into the rock. So let's stay with that image for a moment. Someone or something millions of years in the future, standing where you are now, try to read us from the earth itself. They wouldn't see cities lit up at night. They wouldn't hear our languages or scroll our timelines. They'd have rock cores, fossil fragments, maybe a few odd materials trapped in sediments. To them, we'd be a pattern. A thin band of time where carbon levels changed quickly, where certain metals suddenly became more common, where remnants of strange, synthetic compounds appeared and then faded. If they were cautious, they'd probably start with the simplest explanation. Something happened here, a burst of activity, a rapid change, maybe a species that altered its environment. They might argue about it. Some would say, this looks like a natural climate event. Others might point out that some of the patterns feel unusual. But none of them would be able to see what you see when you look around your room right now. The objects, the screens, the tiny choices that define your life. Those things don't fossilize easily. And that's an important reminder. Most of civilization's reality is invisible to deep time. Now, turn that thought around. Because we are, in a way, already playing a role of that future observer. But looking backward instead of forward, we dig into rock layers. We drill into the seafloor. We slice ice cores and red bubbles of ancient air. We see strange transitions in the record, mass extinctions, sudden climate swings, odd spikes in certain elements. And just like that future geologist, our first response is to ask, what natural process could have caused this? Most of the time, that's the right question. Earth has been through plenty, without our help. Enormous volcanic eruptions have shrouded the sky in ash. Huge impact events have scattered rare metals around the globe. Shifts in ocean circulation have transformed climate in ways that show up as sharp boundaries in the rock. There's no need to invoke ancient civilizations to explain those things. But once you're aware of how we would look from far in the future, it quietly opens up another question. If we're leaving behind a faint industrial fingerprint, is it possible something like that could exist before us, buried deeper in time? Some scientists have actually played with that idea, not as a belief, but as a thought experiment. They ask, if an industrial civilization had existed millions of years ago, what would we expect to find? Not buildings, not machines. Those are too fragile. But maybe anomalous chemical signals in certain rock layers. unusual combinations of metals, changes in carbon isotopes that suggest rapid burning of stored carbon like fossil fuels, patterns in sediment that hint at large-scale land use or deforestation. And then they flip the question again. Do we see anything like that already? The honest answer is that we do see oddities in the geological record. But Earth is so good at producing its own weirdness that it's very hard to tell what's just nature being dramatic and what might hint at something else. There are rock layers with strange metal concentrations that likely came from asteroid impacts. There are abrupt climate shifts that probably resulted from massive volcanic events or changes in the planet's orbit or long. Term feedback loops in the oceans and atmosphere. There are gaps where species vanish faster than we'd expect, but mass extinctions happen, and they happen without any help from technology. So we're left with a puzzle that, at least for now, refuses to become a clear picture. Nothing we found screams, this was definitely made by a civilization. But the record is incomplete enough that we also can't say, with absolute certainty, that nothing ever happened before us that rose beyond the level of simple ecosystems. Most of the time, we lean on the side of caution and say, we have no solid evidence for earlier civilizations. So for scientific purposes, we assume there weren't any. That's a reasonable position. But here, in this quiet corner, we're allowed to sit in the in between place for a while. We're allowed to acknowledge that no evidence doesn't always equal never existed, especially when time is ruthless and the planet is constantly rewriting itself. You can think of it like walking into a house where dozens of families have lived, one after another. Some of them left photographs and letters in the attic. We can reconstruct their lives pretty well. That's human history with writing, buildings, and artifacts we can still find. Others left only scuffed marks on the floor or a faint discoloration on the wall where a piece of furniture once stood. That's prehistory and the fossil record. And some families might have lived there so long ago and left so little behind that all evidence of them has been painted over, replaced, or ripped out during renovations. That's deep time. We're very good at telling the stories of the most recent tenants. We're pretty good at guessing some details about the ones before that. But once you go far enough back, the house stops giving up its secrets. It doesn't mean no one ever lived there. It just means the walls don't remember. That's how the Earth is. We drill, we dig, we scrape. We read what we can. But there are entire floors of this planetary house that have been gutted, remodeled, or torn down and rebuilt completely. Huge sections of the seafloor, for example, are young in geological terms. The ocean crust gets recycled back into the mantle over tens of millions of years. That means anything that might once have rested on those ancient sea floors is gone, literally swallowed by the planet and transformed into something else. Continents, too, have shifted, collided, and warped. Land that was once low, lying in calm, may now be high in a mountain range, or buried under kilometers of younger rock. Life that once thrived, there is now just a slight change in mineral composition, if that. So when people get excited about specific, out-of-place artifacts, a metal sphere in old rock, a tool-shaped stone, a structure underwater that looks a little too straight, the responsible response is almost always, let's look for natural explanations first. And usually there is one. Stone can fracture into sharp edges that look like tools. Minerals can grow into geometric shapes that look manufactured. Sediment can settle in ways that mimic terraces or walls. Modern objects can get into older layers through cracks and disturbances. Most of the famous mystery artifacts have turned out to be misinterpretations, hoaxes, or geological quirks. And yet, even after you clear away all the dramatic claims and internet rumors, a softer curiosity remains. Not the loud, this changes everything kind of curiosity. The quiet, we still don't know everything kind. Because even if every single strange object we've ever found turns out to have a boring explanation, that still doesn't change the bigger reality. We've only sampled a tiny fraction of the Earth's crust. We've mapped a small portion of the ocean floor in high detail. We've explored only the very top layers of rock in a few locations. It's a bit like reading a few scattered paragraphs from a massive, ancient book and confidently declaring, well, I think we got the full story now. Science doesn't actually do that. Scientists are usually careful. They say things like, as far as we know, And given the evidence we currently have, and the simplest explanation is the tension comes when those cautious phrases meet our very human love of neat narratives. We like the idea that we know where we fit, that we're the first, that history flows from primitive to advanced in one clear line. But the Earth doesn't promise us that. The Earth only promises movement, change, and the occasional trace left behind when the conditions are just right. Maybe intelligence is a one-time event here. Maybe we really are the first species to build global civilizations and change the climate on this scale. Or maybe we're part of a longer pattern we haven't fully recognized yet. Not a copy, paste repetition. Not a hidden super advanced niche of beings behind the scenes, but echoes. Similar struggles. Similar breakthroughs. Similar blind spots. In the next stretch, we'll drift into that idea a bit more. How knowledge can rise, vanish, and rise again. How some of the things that feel too advanced for ancient humans might actually be part of a deeper rhythm. Intelligence rediscovering the same patterns whenever conditions allow. Let's talk about knowledge for a while. Not facts written in books or stored on servers, but knowledge is a living thing, moving through minds, passed between generations, rising and disappearing like tides. Because once you notice how knowledge behaves inside our history, it becomes easier to imagine how it might have behaved in histories we'll never see. One of the strange things about human civilization is how often we rediscover things we've already discovered before. Techniques, ideas, mathematical insights, medicinal plants, navigation methods. They show up, flourish, then get lost when the culture that carried them falls apart. Centuries go by, then somewhere else, under different skies, someone starts from scratch and finds almost the same solution. We like to imagine that knowledge progresses in a straight line. Stone tools, then bronze, then iron, then industry, then digital technology in one clean ascent. But if you zoom in, the line is messy. There are rises and plateaus, peaks of understanding and long, quiet stretches where certain skills are simply gone. Think of ancient medicine. Many early cultures knew surprisingly effective remedies. Plants that reduce pain, herbs that fight infection, mixtures that calm the body enough to survive surgery. Some of these treatments were passed down for generations, then vanished when those societies collapsed or changed. Centuries later, modern science discovers the same plants and compounds and confirms they work. From the outside, it looks like a new breakthrough. From a wider perspective, it looks like the return of something that's been found before. Or take early astronomy. Long before telescopes, ancient people tracked the sky with patience we can barely imagine. They watched stars rise and set. They noticed slow shifts in their positions over years and decades. They aligned structures with solstices, equinoxes, and specific stars. Some cultures understood the length of a year with impressive precision. Some knew the approximate size of the Earth. Some even detected precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, by comparing star positions across generations. That kind of knowledge doesn't require advanced technology. It requires time, stability, and a decision to watch carefully for a very long while. But even so, there's a pattern. Deep insight appears, then partially disappears, then reappears. We see this with architecture too. Techniques used by one civilization, like specific stone cutting methods, mortar compositions, or acoustically tuned structures, vanish when that society declines. Later, another group reinvents something similar, not because they inherited the knowledge directly, but because the same physical problems push them towards similar solutions. In some cases, they actually do inherit fragments. A legend about how something used to be done. A half-remembered technique. A ritual that no one fully understands anymore, but continues anyway. Civilizations are full of these leftovers. Habits whose origins are forgotten. Symbols whose original meaning has dissolved. Structures whose purpose is guessed at rather than known. Now stretch that pattern out. If knowledge within a single species can rise, fall, and rise again across just a few thousand years, what might happen over millions? How many cycles of discovery and loss could fit into that space? And if intelligence has appeared more than once on Earth, each time under different conditions, how many of the patterns we consider ours might simply be the natural shape of problem solving in this environment. Maybe that's why certain things feel strangely inevitable once a society reaches a particular level of complexity. Writing, agriculture, number systems, calendars, trade networks, stories about floods and resets and earlier ages of the world. They show up in multiple, disconnected cultures because the conditions that call for them keep reappearing. Food surplus? You get storage. Storage? You get accounting. Accounting? You get symbols, then writing. Writing? You get laws, stories, and shared memory that can outlive any one person. But what if this chain isn't unique to humans? What if it's what intelligence does when it meets certain environmental pressures? That doesn't mean we're literally remembering the knowledge of some forgotten civilization. It just means that the same planet with the same constraints might encourage similar patterns, whether it's humans or something else doing the thinking. Still, there are parts of our story that feel almost like echoes, ancient myths that talk about multiple ages of the world, creation, destruction, renewal, and cycles of rising and falling peoples. Stories passed orally for generations can stretch far back beyond written history. They can fold together memories of real events, floods, volcanic eruptions, dramatic climate shifts, and wrap them in symbols. Over time, the little details fade, but the shape of the story survives. There was a world before this one. Something happened, and now we live in its aftermath. We usually read those as metaphor, and they're metaphor. But metaphors often grow from real experiences. If early humans lived through the last major glacial melt or rising seas swallowed ancestral coastlines, they would have witnessed transformations so massive that the world ended and was remade wouldn't be an exaggeration. It would be a personal truth. Later generations, hearing those stories, might no longer know what specific event triggered them, but the sense of being later rivals to an older planet would remain. Now imagine going beyond human memory entirely. Imagine if long before us, another intelligent species lived through their own cycles of rise and fall. Their knowledge would have had its own arcs, discoveries, traditions, breakthroughs, and losses. None of that would reach us directly. Their languages, symbols, and tools would be gone, but the patterns might still rhyme with ours. They might have learned to map their environment. They might have noticed regularities in the sky. They might have developed ways to predict seasons, track resources, understand cause and effect. Some of their insights about numbers, geometry, or cycles wouldn't belong to them alone. Those ideas are woven into the fabric of reality itself. Anyone who stares at the world long enough with a curious mind is likely to notice them. So when we marvel that ancient humans discovered sophisticated mathematics too early, or built precise observatories without the right tools, it might help to remember that they weren't inventing reality. They were noticing it. If intelligence has arisen more than once, then noticing those patterns might be something the Earth keeps inviting its thinking species to do. There's another side to this, though: how easily knowledge disappears. We live in a time where it feels like nothing can truly be lost. Everything's stored, backed up, mirrored, synced. But all those backups depend on fragile conditions: electricity, infrastructure, social stability, the existence of people who care enough to keep the systems running. Take that away, and our knowledge would start collapsing surprisingly fast. Within decades, much of our digital information would become inaccessible. Within centuries, most books would have decayed without careful preservation. Within thousands of years, only inscriptions carved into especially durable materials might remain, and even those could be weathered down until they were unreadable. The formulas, the theories, the everyday know how of using complex tools, gone. What would survive would be whatever small, practical pieces people carried in their habits and stories. We've already seen smaller versions of this. Skills go extinct. Languages die. Entire bodies of tradition vanish when the last people who practice them pass away. If that can happen in a world where information can fly across the globe in seconds, imagine how much more easily it could happen in earlier ages, where knowledge lived mostly in memory and handmade objects. It doesn't take a catastrophe to erase sophistication. It just takes time, scattering, and a few breaks in the chain of teaching. And across millions of years, nature is very good at breaking chains. So we end up with this quietly haunting possibility. Maybe knowledge, like life itself, has bloomed and withered on this planet more than once. Maybe civilizations have risen to their own forms of understanding, looked around, wondered about their place in the world, and then faded so completely that, for us, they're nothing more than unknown layers beneath our feet. Not in a dramatic, hidden, super niche way, not in a conspiracy way, just in the simple, almost gentle way that time erases detail. What we're left with in our moment is the opportunity to look both backward and inward. Backward, at the patchy record of the Earth's past, at the structures, artifacts, and traces left by our own ancestors, at the sudden jumps in knowledge that seem to come from nowhere. Inward, at the patterns we keep repeating, and the cycles of discovery, and forgetting we're already caught up in. We don't need to prove that someone came before us to learn from this perspective. The value of the question isn't in the answer, it's in what it does to our sense of scale. It reminds us that knowledge is fragile, even when it feels solid, that civilizations are temporary, even when they feel like the center of everything, and that intelligence, whatever form it takes, might be less a singular event and more a repeating theme in the long, patient story of a changing planet. In the next stretch, we'll move from knowledge itself to the idea of resets, the quiet ways Earth has already wiped and rewritten its own surface, and how those natural cycles might erase almost any trace of whoever came before. When people hear the phrase reset, their minds often jump straight to something dramatic. A giant asteroid streaking through the sky, a sudden flash, an instant end. But if you listen to how the Earth actually tells its story, most resets are much quieter than that. They're not single moments. They're long transitions spread across thousands or millions of years. So slow that anyone alive at the time might not have felt like they were living through a reset at all. They were just living through weather, through slightly different seasons, through rivers that shifted a little, through harvests that weren't quite what they used to be. From here, with the benefit of time and data, we look back and say, oh, that was the end of an age. From inside it, it probably felt like things are changing, but life goes on. This difference between how change feels while you're in it and how it looks on a timeline is important when we talk about civilizations, especially hypothetical ones that might have existed long before humanity. When we picture an ancient civilization being wiped out, we often imagine a single catastrophe, a world-ending event that snaps everything in half. But in reality, the most effective resets aren't always sudden. Sometimes they're like a tide that rises grain by grain. Think about climate. Earth's climate has shifted many times. Ice ages advanced and retreated. Regions that were once green and fertile turned dry and dusty. Rain belts slid north or south. Sea levels crept up, swallowing low, lying land. If a civilization depended heavily on a particular climate, say, stable rainfall or predictable river floods, a slow shift could quietly undermine it. Year by year, the change might be almost invisible. A slightly shorter rainy season, a bit more heat, a bit less snowpack in the mountains feeding the rivers, one bad harvest, then another, then 3 in a decade. People adapt as long as they can. They move uphill, they dig wells, they switch crops, they trade more with distant groups. But there's a threshold where adaptation becomes harder than leaving. And when people move, especially over generations, something else moves with them. Forgetfulness. Old structures get abandoned. Old irrigation systems fall out of use. Old knowledge becomes less relevant to the new land and slowly fades. From the outside, on a timeline, this might look like a clear turning point. Civilization X declined around this time due to climate change. From the inside, it was just families doing what they needed to survive. Now imagine that not over centuries, but stretched across hundreds of thousands of years. Conditions slowly sliding away from what a particular intelligent species was adapted to. Their civilization bending, until eventually it breaks into smaller, simpler ways of living. After enough time passes, the large-scale civilization part disappears. What remains might be scattered groups, surviving in pockets, no longer able to maintain or even remember the complex systems their ancestors once built. Another layer of reset comes from geology itself. Earth's surface isn't solid in the long run. Continents drift. Plates slide past, collide, and pull apart. New oceans open. Old oceans close. Imagine building a city on a section of crust that, in the far future, will be shoved into a subduction zone, one of those regions where one plate gets pushed under another and sinks slowly into the mantle. From your point of view, you've built on land. Stable, familiar land. From Earth's point of view, you've built on a temporary platform that will eventually be recycled. Given enough time, that city will be dragged downward. Rock would deform under enormous pressure. Minerals would rearrange. Temperatures would rise. Your buildings, your tools, your artifacts, if they reached that depth, wouldn't just be buried. They'd be transformed, melted, folded into new rocks that might one day reappear as volcanic material somewhere else entirely. On human timescales, land feels permanent. On geological timescales, it's just passing through. Then there are more chaotic events. Massive volcanic eruptions, flood basalts, periods where whole regions are drowned in lava over long stretches of time. Even without advanced civilization, these events reshape climate and ecosystems. Add a civilization living on top of that, and the disruption becomes even more severe. Ash clouds blotting out sunlight, crops failing, air and water quality deteriorating, land physically buried under thick basalt flows. If that happened to a technologically active species millions of years ago, the land where their largest city stood might now be solid rock, with any trace of their existence trapped beneath layers too deep to access. And yet, none of this really looks like the end from the inside, from the perspective of someone living through it. It's just a series of problems. This season was bad. That river changed course. This land became unusable. Those mountains started venting ash. There's another reset mechanism that works on even slower scales. Biological change. Life reshapes life. New species evolve, competing for the same resources. Diseases jump between hosts. Predators grow more efficient. Plants change the composition of the atmosphere. You might think of intelligence as a kind of advantage. And it is, but it isn't a guarantee. An intelligent species still depends on an environment it can survive in. If other species evolve in ways that change that environment, overgrazing, new pathogens, new competitors, those shifts can push even a clever species toward decline. A civilization might respond for a while. More planning, more medicine, more control over agriculture and ecosystems. But if the underlying conditions keep drifting out of alignment, there comes a point where complexity becomes a burden instead of a strength. Systems with many moving parts need stability. When stability disappears, those systems become harder to hold together. Sometimes, the simplest response is the most effective. Do less. Scale down. Leave. That's one way civilizations fade. Not in a blaze, but in a gradual simplifying of life. You can imagine a version of this happening long before us, in a world with completely different plants, animals, climates, and coastlines. A species rises, builds, organizes, and tries to hold its environment in a stable pattern. For a while, it works. Then conditions begin to shift in ways that are too broad and deep to fully control. From within, the story is about politics, culture, religion, conflict, and daily survival. From the outside, across millions of years, it's just another curve. Up then down. A reset. The thing about resets, though, is that they don't just end things. They also clear space. After a mass extinction or a major climatic shift, there's often an explosion of new forms of life as species adapt to fill the empty niche spaces. Diversity returns, but in a different shape. You can think of it as the planet rearranging the cast of characters. Some roles go away. New ones appear. The story continues, but with a different script. If intelligence is one of the possible roles, there's no reason it has to be filled only once. Maybe most of the time, the cast doesn't evolve anything that complex. Maybe many eras go by with no one asking big questions or building complex societies. But given enough time, enough experiments, enough evolutionary twists, it's not unreasonable to imagine that intelligence might appear, disappear, and reappear across different ages. Not in a tidy cycle like clockwork. Not in a way that guarantees someone has come before us. Just as something that could happen more than once on a planet that keeps shuffling conditions. What makes this idea feel softer and oddly calming is that it doesn't require any secret control, any hidden puppeteers behind the scenes. It doesn't claim that anyone before us was more advanced than we are now. It simply says, maybe the universe tries similar ideas more than once when given enough time, and Earth has had a lot of time. So when we talk about the Great Reset in this context, we're not talking about a single global conspiracy or a planned event. We're talking about the planet's own long-term habit of rearranging itself. Ice ages advancing and retreating, continents colliding and drifting, seas rising and falling, life exploding in diversity, then contracting, civilizations, ours and any hypothetical others, coming together, then gently unwinding back into the landscape. Resets are not personal. They're not aimed at us. They're part of how a dynamic world works. What we do control to some extent is how we move through our part of the cycle. We can notice patterns. We can recognize stress in systems before they fully crack. We can pay attention to how fragile our infrastructure and knowledge really are. And perhaps most importantly, we can choose what kind of memory we try to leave behind, not just in stone or data, but in the way we shape the future species, future ecosystems, and maybe even future civilizations that might come after us. Because just as we wonder, quietly, whether someone came before, it's entirely possible that one day, someone will wonder the same thing about us. To really feel how fragile any trace of a civilization is, we have to look closely at the planet itself, not as a backdrop, but as an active force that's constantly editing whatever sits on its surface. Most of the time, we walk around as if the ground under our feet is fixed. Streets feel permanent. Mountains feel eternal. Coastlines feel like they've always been where they are now. But Earth doesn't see it that way. To the planet, everything on the surface is temporary. Stone, soil, rivers, forests, even entire continents. They're all part of slow, restless circulation. And that circulation is very, very good at cleaning up after anything that once existed here. Start with something simple. Erosion. We usually picture erosion as a kind of damage. Cliffs collapsing, soil washing away. But from the planet's point of view, erosion is more like a long-term recycling system. A mountain range might look solid and immovable, but every year, tiny bits of it are being chipped off by wind, rain, ice, roots, and temperature changes. Those fragments slide downhill, get carried by rivers, settle in lakes, or get swept out into the ocean. Given enough time, sharp peaks become rounded hills. Hills become plains. Old rock crumbles into new sediment, ready to be pressed into rock again somewhere else. Now imagine a structure built high in those mountains, something we think of as imposing and permanent. From the moment it's left alone, weather starts pulling it apart. Cracks widen, edges soften, pieces fall and get carried away. 10,000 years later, you might have a few scattered blocks. 1,000,000 years later, those blocks are part of the slope. 50 million years later, the entire region might be unrecognizable. The structure never gets an official demolition. It just blends back into the landscape, grain by grain. Rivers are even more relentless. A river isn't just water moving downhill. It's a moving blade that carves its way through stone. It undercuts banks, carries rocks and sand, grinds them down, and spreads its material across floodplains and deltas. Build too close to a river, and over time, you're building on borrowed land. The water will shift its channel, eat away at foundations, undermine walls, smuggle pieces of your structures downstream, and drop them somewhere you'd never associate with city. On short time scales, we call it flooding. On long ones, it's just the river doing what rivers do. Coastlines are just as busy, maybe more. Stand on a rocky shore and it feels solid. But waves are constantly cutting into cliffs, breaking off pieces, grinding them into pebbles, then into sand. Storms hit, water rises, and whole sections of coast can vanish over a few centuries. Now stretch that to hundreds of thousands of years. Sea levels go up and down as ice ages come and go. What was once land becomes shallow sea. What was one sea becomes land. A harbor town from some distant age could easily end up 50 kilometers inland, or 50 kilometers offshore under layers of silt and sand. Anything it left behind would be first drowned, then buried, then possibly compacted into rock. If we drilled into that rock millions of years later, We might see slightly odd layering, a subtle change in grain size or composition, but not a clear "Here's to the city" sign. Forests have their own quiet way of erasing. If you've ever seen photos of buildings abandoned for just a few decades, you know how quickly plants move in. Roots pry apart stone. Vines pull down walls. Trees grow up through floors, pushing apart what used to be flat and controlled. In warm, wet environments, organic materials decay incredibly fast. Wood rots. Textiles fall apart. Leather turns to mush. Even bones don't last long unless they're buried in just the right conditions. So a civilization that built mostly from organic materials, wood, fiber, clay, plant-based composites, could vanish almost completely in a few thousand years if the forest takes over. Multiply that by millions of years, and whatever was there becomes part of soil. Deserts erase in a different way, through movement. Sand dunes aren't static. They roll, slowly carried by the wind. An entire settlement can be buried over the course of a few centuries. Once under meters of sand, wind, driven grains act like sandpaper, wearing down exposed edges, rounding corners, smoothing surfaces. Given enough time, those buried structures can compact and harden into sandstone. At that point, you don't have ruins anymore. You have rock, a layer among layers. Even ice, which seems frozen and still, can be incredibly destructive. Glaciers don't sit gently on the land. They grind. They drag boulders. They carve valleys. They scrape away soil and rock, carrying debris dozens or hundreds of kilometers before dropping it elsewhere. Anything unlucky enough to sit under a moving glacier, buildings, roads, entire towns, will be crushed, scattered, and scraped beyond recognition. When the ice melts, it leaves a jumbled landscape of rocks and sediment with no clear sign of what once existed there. Earthquakes, landslides, volcanic eruptions, they all play their part, burying or breaking apart whatever stands in their path. When you put all of this together, a pattern emerges. Nature doesn't preserve things for us. It preserves them by accident, when conditions line up just right. That's how we get fossils. For a fossil to form, the organism needs to be buried quickly in sediment that protects it from scavengers, oxygen, and decay. Minerals slowly seep in and replace organic material. The surrounding layers need to stay relatively undisturbed for a very long time. Eventually, uplift and erosion might bring that fossil back into daylight. It's a rare chain of events. Most living things simply disappear. Structures can be accidentally preserved in similar ways. Volcanic ash can bury a town, sealing it off from weather. Mud flows can entomb an area in layers of wet sediment that later hardens into rock. Lakes and bogs can create low, oxygen conditions where wood, and even some soft materials last longer than they should. But even those time capsules don't last forever. Given enough time, rock itself is deformed, melted, or eroded away. There's another kind of memory, though, that nature keeps. Chemical memory. When something big happens, like large-scale burning, industrial activity, or unusual changes in the amount of certain elements, it can leave a faint chemical trace in sediments and rocks. Today, for example, humans are leaving behind elevated carbon levels in the atmosphere and oceans, microplastics in sediments, traces of artificial compounds that didn't exist before us, shifts in nitrogen and phosphorus from agriculture. Some of these will fade. Some will get mixed into the planet's deeper layers. Some might remain detectable for millions of years under the right conditions. If an earlier civilization had existed and used energy sources the way we do, burning stored carbon, mining certain metals, producing synthetic substances, it might also have left behind unusual chemical signatures. But here's the hard part. Nature leaves weird chemical signatures too. Volcanoes can inject metals and gases into the air and oceans. Asteroid impacts can scatter rare elements across the globe. Huge algae blooms can alter carbon levels. Shifts in ocean circulation can change how sediments trap certain compounds. So even if you spotted a thin layer of rock with strange chemistry deep in the past, it would be incredibly difficult to say, this is definitely artificial. You'd probably start with natural causes, just like we do now. And you might be right, or you might be missing something you have no good way to see. That's the central tension. Earth erases clearly and remembers vaguely. A beautifully carved statue can be ground down into featureless gravel. A city can be reduced to an uneven patch of soil. But a sudden spike in some element might linger as a faint, ambiguous line in the rock. Not a story, just a hint. Scientists, understandably, are careful with hints. You don't rewrite the history of life on Earth because of one odd line in a rock core or one strange object in a quarry. Most of the time, caution is the right move. There are natural explanations for almost everything we've found so far. But while science does the necessary work of being careful and skeptical, you and I, sitting here in this slower space, can hold a slightly wider view. We can accept that nature is fully capable of erasing almost every trace of whatever came before us. We can accept that its memories are fragmented and partial. We can admit that, beyond a certain depth in time, the past becomes less a detailed record and more a set of quiet, scattered clues. Not enough to build a solid case. Maybe never enough. But enough to keep the door of possibility ajar. In that gap between what's gone and what remains, the imagination steps in, not to replace science, but to accompany it. To say, if the planet is as talented at wiping the slate, then maybe it's not so strange that we don't see clear signs of earlier intelligence. And maybe the right question isn't why don't we see them, but what would we expect to see if they ever existed at all? That's where we'll wander next, into those faint puzzle pieces, geological oddities, out of place finds, underwater formations, chemical anomalies. Not to declare them proof of anything, but to see how they fit into this much larger picture of a world that remembers in fragments and forgets almost everything else. By now, we spent a lot of time with the idea of forgotten civilizations, how time erases, how Earth resets, how fragile evidence really is. So let's step a little closer to the kind of thing that tends to capture people's curiosity. The puzzle pieces. Not grand, undeniable ruins. Not machines or towers frozen in stone. But small, strange details in the record that make researchers pause. Not because they prove anything, but because they don't slide neatly into the story we already tell. Think of them as little question marks scattered through deep time. Sometimes those question marks appear in the form of shapes. You probably heard of stones that look like tools, sharp edges, flaked surfaces, points that seem too regular to be random. Archaeologists spend a lot of time arguing over things like this. Take a rock with a sharp edge. Is it a tool or just a piece of stone that happened to break the right way? On the surface, it's a simple question. But when you zoom in on microscopic or patterns, on how the rock fractured, on where it was found, that simple question becomes a long debate. Some researchers say these edges were clearly shaped by early humans or their relatives. Others say, no, natural processes can make flakes like this. You're reading intention into geology. Sometimes new evidence leans one way or the other. Sometimes it never quite settles. Most of the time, the discussion stays within the bounds of human evolution. How early did tool use begin? Who made what? What counts as a real tool? But watching those debates unfold tells us something important. Even in relatively recent layers, where we know tool making hominins existed, it can be surprisingly hard to prove intention from a single piece of stone. Now imagine trying to do that for something tens of millions of years older. Even if an ancient intelligent species had left behind tool, like objects, erosion, pressure, and heat would have altered them. Sharp edges would soften. Context would be lost. We'd be left with something that, at best, looks suggestive. And suggestive doesn't carry much weight in science. It leaves room for curiosity, but not for certainty. Other puzzle pieces show up as objects that don't seem to match their surroundings. There are stories, some investigated, some exaggerated, about metal fragments found in rock layers older than our species, or small spheres embedded in mineral deposits that, on paper, predate human industry. Most of these turn out to be either modern contamination, something that slipped into a crack or cavity in the rock much later, misdated or misdescribed layers, natural formations that just happen to look artificial. But a few remain on the edge of understanding. Not dramatic enough to rewrite history, not clear enough to dismiss easily. They sit in that frustrating middle ground of we're not quite sure. Again, that doesn't mean they're relics of an ancient civilization. Nature can be weird. Geology can surprise us. The more we look, the more oddities we're going to find simply because the Earth has had so long to experiment. Then there are underwater formations. Our coastlines today aren't where coastlines used to be. At the end of the last ice age, for example, sea levels rose significantly as glaciers melted. Vast areas of land that once held rivers, forests, and possibly early human settlements are now on continental shelves, submerged under tens of meters of water and sediment. When divers and sonar scans reveal what look like terraces, step-like structures, or regular patterns of stone on the seafloor, people naturally wonder, is this just geology, or did someone build here when it was dry land? Often, closer examination shows natural processes at work. Fractured rock, ancient shorelines, volcanic formations. But the question keeps coming back because the ocean floor is still one of the least explored landscapes on the planet. Even if we leave aside the deep, ancient oceans and just focus on relatively shallow areas flooded in the last 20,000 years, there are huge regions where we don't yet have detailed maps. And that's just the recent past. If you imagine a civilization rising 50 or 100 million years ago near a coastline that no longer exists along a continent that's been shifted, broken, or sunk, their structures, if they had any, would likely be long gone or inaccessible. What might remain would be hints, subtle changes in sediment layers, odd erosion patterns, traces of altered rock buried too deep for casual exploration. Another class of puzzle pieces lives in the fossil record itself. Sometimes, species appear or disappear in ways that feel abrupt, even when we account for how patchy fossils can be. A layer of rock filled with a diverse array of life, followed by a layer where many of those forms are gone and new ones take their place. Mass extinctions explain some of these transitions. Volcanism, impacts, and massive environmental shifts explain others. But there are smaller, less famous transitions where the pace of change still raises eyebrows. Not enough to shout, "Mystery civilization," but enough to whisper, "We don't fully understand what happened here." Then there are chemical and magnetic oddities. Some rock layers show spikes in elements that don't usually appear at those concentrations. Others show rapid shifts in the orientation of magnetic minerals, records of how Earth's magnetic field was behaving when that rock formed. We know the planet's magnetic poles wander and even flip. We know volcanic activity, ocean chemistry, and biological processes can all cause strange chemical signatures. But tucked in among the well, explained anomalies are few that feel incomplete, like half-solved riddles. Every time one of these is found, the process is similar. Gather data, propose natural explanations, test those explanations, argue, refine, and eventually either reach a consensus or leave open. Very rarely does someone in that process seriously propose ancient civilization as a cause. Not because it's logically impossible, but because science works from what's most likely and most consistent with everything else we know. Given how many dramatic things have happened on Earth, supervolcanoes, massive impacts, global ice ages, you don't need intelligence to explain most anomalies. The interesting part for us isn't that any one puzzle piece proves anything about earlier civilizations. It's that, taken together, they show just how incomplete our understanding still is. A sphere here, a strange layer there, a fossil gap in one place, an odd formation underwater, a metal concentration that doesn't quite fit expectations. Each of these on its own has a long list of natural explanations, yet together they sketch the outline of a larger truth. We're reading an ancient story from missing pages. The Earth is old enough that anomalies aren't surprising. In fact, it would be more surprising if everything we found fit perfectly into our current models. So where does that leave our quiet question about forgotten civilizations? Not in a place of proof, not in a place of confident denial, but in a kind of middle ground. The puzzle pieces we've found so far are better explained by nature than by technology, but the sheer complexity and age of the planet mean we can't completely close the door on the idea that intelligence might have arisen before us and left behind traces too subtle or too altered for us to recognize. So instead of treating each anomaly as a yes or no test, we can treat them as reminders that our picture of the past is partial, that some questions will remain open, that the Earth holds more stories than we may ever be able to read, and maybe most importantly, They remind us not to confuse what we know so far with all that can be known. Because even if no other civilization ever existed before ours, the humility we gain from considering that possibility changes how we see ourselves. It softens the idea that we're the inevitable peak of history. It nudges us away from thinking of our time as the default state of the world. And it turns our attention back towards something we often overlook, the patterns that keep emerging with or without us. In the next part, we'll switch focus from rocks and artifacts to something a little more abstract, but just as revealing, the way knowledge, myths, and impossible understanding show up in human history, and how some of those echoes might tie into this bigger question of cycles, resets, and worlds that came before. There's another kind of evidence people turn to when they wonder about forgotten worlds. Not physical evidence, but story. Not stone, not metal, but memory. Old texts, myths, legends passed through centuries. Strange bits of knowledge that seem to show up too early, as if someone skipped a few steps. And while stories aren't proof, they are interesting mirrors. They tell us something about how humans sense time, how we relate to the past, and how we keep bumping into the same questions over and over. Let's start with something simple. Ancient people were very observant. Long before modern science, long before telescopes or satellites, human beings were quietly tracking the world with a level of patience we rarely maintain today. They watched the sky every night. They noticed how certain stars rose and set at specific times of year. They built calendars that aligned with solstices, equinoxes, and lunar cycles. They told stories to lock those patterns into memory. From our point of view, some of this looks astonishing. How did they know the length of the year so precisely? How did they track planetary motions without advanced tools? How did they align structures with cosmic events so exactly? It's easy to jump to the idea of secret knowledge. A lost source, an older teacher, an earlier civilization handing down wisdom. But there's another explanation that doesn't require anything mysterious. If you live under dark skies night after night, and your survival depends on seasons, you get very, very good at paying attention. You pass observations down across generations. You encode them into rituals, myths, and architecture. You build structures that become giant stone memory devices, places that physically embody the knowledge of when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect changes in weather. So when we see advanced astronomical understanding in ancient cultures, we don't necessarily need to assume it came from somewhere else. But it does show something important. Humans are capable of building deep, accurate knowledge of the world using nothing but time, curiosity, and shared attention. And that brings us gently to the myths. In cultures all over the world, there are stories about earlier ages, golden times, lost worlds, great floods, cycles of creation and destruction, different names, different symbols, different gods, but the same repeating themes. The world has not always been as it is now. Something happened. An earlier order ended, and a new one began. It's tempting to read these as literal histories. There was a previous advanced civilization, and these stories are half forgotten records of it. And maybe, in a very loose sense, some of them are memories of real events, like rising seas at the end of an ice age, volcanic eruptions, or asteroid impacts. But even without taking them literally, the consistency of those themes tells us something about how people feel when they look at the world. We sense that we arrived late. We walk across landscapes carved by forces older than us. We see fossils in stone. We find the ruins of our own ancestors buried beneath layers of soil. Even without modern geology, ancient people could tell the earth was older than any living memory. So they told stories that gave shape to that feeling. Worlds before this one. Races or beings who lived differently. A time when knowledge was greater, or when people lived closer to the gods. A rupture, a reset, a new age. If intelligence has risen more than once on this planet, those stories may resonate more deeply than we realize. Not as precise records, but as intuitive reflections of a world that really has been through many cycles. Even if no earlier civilization ever existed, the stories still remind us of something true. We are not at the beginning of Earth. We are walking onto a stage that's been used, cleared, and rebuilt many times. Then there's the impossible knowledge category. Ancient cultures who, estimated the size of the Earth with surprising accuracy, used geometry to design structures that rival modern precision, created calendars that track planetary cycles with remarkable detail, understood medicinal plants that modern science later validated. These examples often get pulled into conversations about lost civilizations. How could they know that? People ask, unless someone older, someone more advanced told them. But again, there's a quieter, less dramatic explanation. Reality is consistent. If you watch the sky long enough, you'll find the same patterns we do. If you measure shadows carefully, you can estimate the Earth's curve. If you want to build stable structures, you'll eventually discover geometry. If your community experiments with plants, you'll eventually find which ones help and which ones harm. Any intelligent species living on this planet, in any age, would face similar needs. How do we track time? How do we measure space? How do we predict seasons? How do we heal? How do we build? The solutions aren't infinite. The world nudges you towards certain answers. So when we see sophisticated knowledge appear suddenly in the archaeological record, it may not actually be sudden at all. It might represent the visible tip of a long, slow build-up we don't have full documentation for. A lot of trial and error doesn't fossilize. The struggling attempts, the failed experiments, the local versions that never spread, those disappear, leaving only one polished example that looks like it came out of nowhere. Still, it's hard to shake the feeling sometimes that there's a ghost of something older hiding in these patterns. Like we're not just discovering the world, but rediscovering it. If intelligence has appeared before, maybe that sense of we've been here before somehow is not about literal memory, but about how the world guides thinking along similar paths every time produces minds capable of asking deep questions. Another curious thing about old stories is how they sometimes seem to encode geological or astronomical events in symbolic form. Myths about fires raining from the sky, long darkness or strange seasons, seas swallowing land, mountains rising or splitting open. From our modern vantage point, we can match some of these to real processes. Volcanic eruptions, impacts, long winters caused by ash or dust, tectonic shifts, rapid sea level rise. People who lived through those things, or whose ancestors did, would have had their worlds reshaped in ways that demanded explanation. In the absence of scientific language, they reached for gods, cycles, cosmic battles, images strong enough to carry the memory. So buried inside what looks like fantasy might be a very real awareness. The earth changes, sometimes slowly, sometimes violently, and when it does, the world before is gone. Whether or not any ancient civilization existed before us, that message is worth hearing. Then there's the way certain ideas keep coming back even within human culture. Concepts of time as a cycle rather than a line, ages of the world that repeat in different forms, knowledge being lost and regained, humanity as part of a pattern, not the peak of it. These show up in philosophy, religion, myth, and even in the quiet intuitions people feel when they look at old ruins or weathered landscapes. Maybe that's just us recognizing cycles we can now see clearly. Ecosystems that collapse and rebuild. Climates that warm and cool. Economies that boom and bust. Or maybe it's a deeper instinct. An awareness that the universe doesn't typically do one-off events. Stars are born, live, and die in countless millions. Planets form, collide, and reform. Life evolves, goes extinct, evolves again. Why would intelligence be any different? That doesn't prove there was someone before us, but it makes the thought feel less like a stretch and more like a natural extension of what the universe already does. And in the end, that's what all of this comes back to. Not a demand that we believe in a prior civilization, but an invitation to sit in a slightly wider frame. A frame where our knowledge is impressive, but young. Our stories are vivid but incomplete. Our place in time is meaningful, but not guaranteed to be unique. We can appreciate the myths without needing them to be literal logs of a lost age. We can marvel at ancient knowledge without assuming it came from some hidden teacher. We can look at patterns, rise, peak, fall, reset, and recognize that they may be bigger than humanity, woven into the structure of a changing world. In the next part, We'll zoom out one more time, away from just the past, and towards something more personal and immediate. What it means for us right now, to be living at the edge of our own chapter, aware that we might not be the first civilization, and almost certainly won't be the last. If you've stayed with this thought all the way to this point, something subtle has probably already started to happen. The question, were there civilizations before us, begins to feel less like a mystery to solve and more like a mirror. Because whether the answer is yes, no, or we can't know, the real way the question lands right here, on us, on this moment, on the particular slice of time you're living in. We are, right now, a civilization standing on the edge of deep time. We're late arrivals on a very old planet. We've climbed fast from stone tools to satellites. We've cracked the code of DNA, touched the edge of space, and built networks that let thoughts move around the world in less than a second. If some earlier intelligence did exist, they might have had their own version of this moment. A time when they first realized just how big their world really was, and how small their window in it might be. We don't know if that ever happened before, but we do know it's happening now with us. And that makes this moment strangely intimate. On one hand, it's humbling. On the other, it's quietly empowering. Because unlike anything hypothetical in deep time, we still have choices. From a distance, you can imagine our story as a neat curve. Hunter-gatherers, early agriculture, cities, industry, technology, whatever comes next. But from the inside, it doesn't feel like a smooth curve at all. It feels like tension. We've unlocked enormous energy sources, but at a cost. We've reshaped climate without fully understanding the feedback loops. We've built complex global systems that are powerful, but also fragile. In other words, we're in that same pattern we've seen before. Growth, complexity, stress. The part of the curve where a civilization has to decide, consciously or not, how it will respond to the conditions it created. And here's where it gets interesting. When we look back at vanished human civilizations, we can often identify stress points. Soil exhaustion, deforestation, water mismanagement, dependence on vulnerable trade routes, rigid social systems that couldn't adjust fast enough. From inside those worlds, people weren't failing. They were doing what made sense in the context they had. They were protecting traditions, maintaining stability, trying to preserve what they'd built. But the Earth had other plans. The climate shifted. The land changed. The patterns they depended on faded. And so slowly no one could see the arc, complexity gave way to simplicity. Cities dwindled. Populations moved. Knowledge thinned out. The landscape took over. Now, for the first time we know of, there's a civilization that can see this pattern while still living inside it. We can look at ice cores and sediment layers and see how often the climate has swung. We can watch sea levels change in real time. We can measure extinctions, track atmospheric chemistry, map the movement of entire ecosystems. We're not guessing anymore. We're watching it happen. And we're seeing something both unsettling and familiar. We are becoming a geological force. If someone millions of years from now drilled into the rock that forms from our time, they'd find clues that something very active lived here. A sharp rise in certain gases. An unusual layer of synthetic materials. A sudden reshaping of land use patterns. Fossil evidence of a species that spread into almost every available niche. To them, we might look like a brief, intense experiment, a rapid flare of complexity. Maybe they'd wonder what it felt like to live through that, to be the species pushing the planet hard enough to leave a visible scar in its layers. You already know the answer, at least for your little patch of it. It feels normal. That's the strange part. We wake up, we check our phones. We go to work or school. We worry about bills or relationships or plans for the weekend. We notice the weather, but only occasionally think about the climate. Resets, cycles, deep time. Those things feel distant, abstract. They belong to documentaries and late night thoughts, not to the errands we run or the dishes we wash. Yet we're living at the kind of moment that, if someone could see the whole Earth timeline laid out, might stand out as a turning point. Not necessarily a collapse, not necessarily a catastrophe, but a transition. The moment when one species became powerful enough to change the environmental rules it depends on. The idea of earlier civilizations makes this more, not less, real. If intelligence has appeared before, we might not be special for existing, but we might be special for noticing, for seeing the pattern, naming it, and asking, what do we want to do with this awareness? Imagine two versions of our future. In one version, we keep acting as if our layer in the rock doesn't matter. We keep burning, extracting, expanding with the assumption that we're just using the world, not rewriting it. In that scenario, from a far future's perspective, we look like many past experiments in complexity. Sudden, intense, brief. A spike in activity. A rearrangement of climate and ecosystems. Then a thinning, a dispersal, a fade. In the other version, we take seriously the idea that we're part of something bigger and older than ourselves. We treat intelligence not just as a survival tool, but as a way to listen, to recognize feedback when the planet says, this is too much too fast, and adjust before the systems we rely on drift too far out of balance. That doesn't mean becoming perfect. It doesn't mean controlling the earth. It doesn't mean stopping change entirely. It means participating in the cycles consciously. Instead of pretending we're outside them, we learn to see ourselves as one more layer in a very long story, and we act accordingly. If earlier civilizations ever reach a moment like this, we don't know what choices they made. We don't even know if they could make choices about global impact, or if their intelligence took a quieter, more localized form. But we can imagine them wondering, in their own way, about the future. We can imagine them standing in their own version of a city at night, looking out over lights or bioluminescent forests, or whatever their world used to glow with, asking themselves what comes next. Whether anyone came before us or not, we are those beings now. You, sitting or lying wherever you are, listening to these thoughts drift by, are part of a civilization that can look billions of years into the past and at least a little way into the future and see the fragile bridge we're standing on. There's a kind of gentle clarity in that. It doesn't tell us what will happen. It doesn't promise that we'll solve everything, but it does strip away one illusion, that history is something happening behind us, while the future is guaranteed to continue the same line we're on. Resets don't ask for permission. Cycles don't pause because the species feels special. The Earth doesn't stabilize just because someone built a city and gave a name. And yet, being aware of those truths changes the quality of our moment. It suggests that what we do, individually small, collectively vast, will shape how our layer looks to whoever or whatever comes after. Will we be a thin line of abrupt disruption and then silence? Or a turning point where civilization realized it was not the beginning, not the end, but part of an ongoing experiment and acted with that in mind? Those are big questions. Too big to hold all at once. So maybe it's enough for now, simply to feel the scale. To feel how small and short our personal lives are against the backdrop of planetary time. And at the same time, how deeply connected they are to the choices of a species that has become capable of altering the whole system it depends on. You are a tiny part of civilization. That is a tiny part of the Earth. That is a tiny part of the universe. But tiny doesn't mean meaningless. If anything, it means that meaning comes from participation, not permanence. Whatever came before us, whatever comes after, we're here now, breathing in air shaped by the breath of ancient forests, walking on land built from the remains of long, vanished worlds, adding our own thin line to the Book of Stone. In the last part of this series, we'll bring it all together, not with a grand answer, but with a gentle closing, a way to sit with the possibility of forgotten civilizations, the certainty of deep time, and the simple, quiet reality of being a human in this moment, on this planet, in this brief chapter we get to call ours. There's a quiet moment that sometimes arrives at the end of a long train of thought like this one, not a conclusion, not a big revelation, just a kind of stillness, like when you've been walking for a long time and you finally stop, not because you've reached a destination, but because you've gone far enough for now. You look around, realize how much ground you've covered, and feel the space stretching out behind and ahead of you. That's where we've arrived. We started with a soft question. What if we're not the first? What if civilization has happened before, risen, flourished, and disappeared so completely that only the faintest hints, if any, remain? Along the way, We've wandered through deep time mass extinctions, the rise and fall of societies, the way Earth erases in half, remembers. We brush against strange artifacts and odd layers of rock, ancient myths, and repeating patterns in human history. We've stood on imagined coastlines of worlds long gone and looked back toward our own place in the story. And now we're here at the edge of the thought. So what do we do with a possibility like this? One option is to treat it as a mystery, to solve at all costs, to search for proof, to hunt relentlessly for that one piece of evidence that shouts, "Yes, there was someone before you." Another option is to shrug and say, "We'll never know, so who cares?" and file it away as an interesting but useless speculation. But there's a quieter third option, the one we've been practicing together. Let the question stay open, not demanding an answer, not pretending we have one, just allowing the possibility to sit beside us for a while and noticing what it does to the way we see ourselves. Because whether or not an earlier civilization ever existed, the effect of considering it is real. It stretches our sense of time. It humbles our sense of importance. It softens the hard edges of the story where humanity is the first, the only, the peak. Instead, we start to imagine ourselves as part of a pattern, a planet that experiments, a biosphere that tries different forms, a universe that doesn't seem to mind repetition. Stars are not shy about repeating themselves. They form in clouds of gas, live their lives, die in similar ways, over and over across galaxies. Planets, too, are not unique in their existence. We've already found dozens of worlds and habitable zones, and we know there are likely billions more. In that context, it would almost be stranger if intelligence never repeated itself than if it did. Maybe Earth has hosted intelligence only once, and we're it. Maybe it's tried before in forms we'll never recognize. Maybe we'll try again, long after we're gone, with a new species formed under different skies and different constellations. We don't have to know which of those is true for the idea to have value. The value is in perspective. Think of how it feels when you realize you're not the main character in everyone else's story. At first it can sting, but then it becomes freeing. You're still important, but you're not required to carry the entire plot. Seeing humanity as one possible chapter instead of the whole book does something similar. It doesn't make us meaningless. It makes us situated. We're one expression of what a thinking planet can do. One experiment in consciousness among who knows how many, across who knows how long. That realization can be oddly comforting. If we're not the first, then intelligence is not a fluke. It's part of the way the universe explores itself, a pattern that might emerge whenever conditions and time align. If we're the first, then our existence is even more precious than we thought. In both cases, the conclusion is the same. This moment matters. Not because it will last forever. It won't. Not because it defines everything that came before. It doesn't. But because it's the one we have. There's another layer to this, too. Something more personal. When you think about ancient civilizations, hypothetical or real, it's easy to focus on their ruins, their technologies, their big achievements. But beneath all of that would have been lives that looked, in some quiet ways, a lot like ours. Someone worrying about a loved one. Someone planning for tomorrow. Someone watching a sunset after a long day. Someone feeling small under a sky full of stars and wondering what it all means. If intelligence has ever appeared before, it likely carried worry, hope, curiosity, fear, joy, boredom, awe. The same emotional palette painted onto a different canvas. And now, across an unfathomable distance in time, here you are, feeling your own version of those things, listening, wondering, maybe letting your mind drift over landscapes you'll never see. In that sense, the idea of forgotten civilizations isn't just about them. It's about you. It asks, if some future being looked back at you as part of a long line, another mind in a sequence of minds stretching across ages, what would you want your brief moment to hold? Not in terms of achievement or legacy. Most of that won't survive geological time anyway. But in terms of awareness, did you notice that you were here? Did you feel the strangeness and beauty of existing at all? Did you understand, even for a second, that you were part of something vast and ancient and ongoing? Civilizations may rise and fall. Resets may come and go. The Earth may rewrite its surface many times over. But awareness, this tiny flame of consciousness you carry, exists right now in you. And that makes this particular point in the timeline quietly extraordinary. For all the talk of deep time and forgotten worlds, most of life is still lived in small moments. The sound of rain against a window, the warmth of a mug in your hands, the weight of a blanket, the glow of a screen in a darkened room, your own breath, slow and steady, as thoughts drift in and out. Those moments are where the vastness of Earth's history and the intimacy of your life intersect. A planet that's seen countless ages, countless species, countless storms. And right now, in this fraction of a second, it's holding you. You, thinking about worlds that may or may not have existed. You, wondering where humanity fits. You, at the edge of sleep or the end of a long day, letting your mind wander across millions of years and then gently return to present. So maybe the gift of this whole exploration isn't an answer about ancient civilizations. Maybe it's a shift in how you feel about your own. The next time you see a city skyline at night, you might picture it the way a future geologist would. A temporary pattern of light, perched on rock that's been many things before and will be many things after. The next time you hear about climate or extinctions or planetary change, you might feel not just fear, but context. A sense that this isn't the first time the Earth is transformed, and that what's new is not the change itself, but the fact that a species witnessing it can understand and respond. The next time you find yourself staring at the stars, you might remember that intelligence could be a repeating rhythm in the universe, not a solo performance. And that right now, for all the uncertainty and noise, you are part of that rhythm. As for whether someone came before us on this planet, it remains a whisper, a possibility that may never step fully into the light of evidence, a question that lives in the space between science and imagination, grounded not in certainty, but in humility. We don't have to close that question. We can let it stay open. We can let it remind us that most of Earth's stories are already gone, that we are walking on the remains of worlds we'll never fully know, and that one day, far in the future, we too will be part of that unseen foundation. Another layer, another chapter, another set of faint signals in the rock. Before that happens, we get this brief window to wonder, to learn, to care, to choose how we live on a planet that has carried so many forms of life and still has room for countless more. If this kind of slow, gentle exploration has kept you company tonight, thank you for staying with it. It means that in this vast span of time, in this tiny overlap of our timelines, we shared a thought. You, wherever you are, on a couch, in bed, in a quiet room under a soft lamp, and this old planet spinning beneath us, full of secrets, full of stories, full of possibilities still unfolding. Maybe we're the first. Maybe we're not. Either way, we're here now. And for this moment, in this breath, that's enough.